Hey everyone, this is Cabane the Christian. Before I get to the content of the video, I'll just say a few words about my Patreon account. Thanks very much to those who became patrons. I deeply appreciate it. I've included the link below and on the screen here for those who haven't seen it or wish to become patrons. Obviously, no problem at all if you don't. Many thanks if you do. What I want to note is that I am doing a per creation model here, so I'm going to put my new videos on Patreon. Of course, you'll still be able to watch them here. It's just a link on Patreon. So if you only want to contribute a certain amount a month, just make sure to cap your monthly contribution at that. So link below, and let's get on to the video. Today I want to talk about classical theism and the Bible, because over the past 100 years, really, this has become a really hot topic. There are many theologians, a lot of liberals, but also some conservatives, who critique the classical theistic portrait of God as inconsistent with biblical revelation. Open theism, which says that God doesn't actually know the future because the future doesn't exist except as a realm of possibilities. Open theism is an extreme manifestation of that. But you also get more moderate manifestations, which are held by very eminent Christian philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, and William Lane Craig, and they are theistic personalists, which is kind of a loose category, but I would say what unites theistic personalists is that most of them are passibilists. In other words, they reject the classical Christian doctrine of divine impassibility. They say God as God does truly suffer. Um, but what I want to talk about today is the God of the Bible in relation to classical theism. Hold on, let me just mute that for a second. Okay, so the God of the Bible in relation to classical theism. Now, as I've expressed here before, I'm a shameless inerrantist. It's not a view I started with, it's a view I ended with as I worked through the Bible in more and more detail. And what that means is that I believe the portrait of God in the Bible is completely consistent with the classical theistic portrait of God, because I'm also Orthodox, and Orthodoxy is classically theistic. But concerning classical theism, I want to emphasize that there are multiple classical theistic portraits of God. There are multiple Christian traditions about God, which would all be classified as classically theistic. Now, when a lot of people say classical theism, what they mean is Thomism. And I have the greatest and deepest respect for St. Thomas. I think he was a brilliant scholar and a genuinely holy man, but I think he was dead wrong on the question of his interpretation of divine simplicity. I don't think that all of God's attributes are reducible to one another. And if you want to argue against my interpretation of Thomism in the comments, that's not really what the video is about. So just please don't. I don't think all of God's attributes can be reduced to one another. I don't think the visible appearances of God in the Old Testament were simply created symbols made because of the weakness of our minds, etc., etc. I think if one wants to really grapple with the biblical witness on its own terms, you have to avoid these ad hoc explanations which are not themselves evidenced in the biblical revelation, because the Bible is the most direct manifestation of God's character apart from direct union with God. Apart from direct union with God, God has gotten the closest to humanity in general in terms of his revelation in the Bible, which is an extension of the incarnation of Jesus. That's what St. Maximus says. So one has to really deal with the Bible on its own terms here. But I think as we do, we will find that it's congruent with classical theism, specifically the Orthodox take on classical theism. Now, Orthodoxy traditionally is Palamite. There are some modern Orthodox theologians who really want to be original and say, oh, no, we're not Palamite. It's like David Bentley Hart, but I mean, David Bentley Hart is a great Roman Catholic theologian. He's not a great Orthodox theologian. But the Orthodox tradition is classically Palamite. In short, St. Gregory Palamas, following the fathers such as Maximus and Basil the Great, He taught that there was a real distinction between what God is and what God does. But what God is what constitutes him as God. What God does is his expressions of what he is outside of himself. And so it is the divine persons who energize or act, and their activity, their energy, reflects the divine nature, but it does not wholly circumscribe it. In other words, you cannot wholly and comprehensively express your nature through your energies. And we say that we only know God in his energies, but we don't just say that. We also say we only know other persons by their energies. We see that God's properties are energies. Now that might seem really unintuitive at first, but let's just think, how do we describe God? We describe him as loving, just, merciful. We say he does not clear the guilty, etc., etc. Why do we call him all these things? Well, these are energies. We say God is loving because he loves. He is just because he executes justice, and so on and so forth. This also applies to the way we speak about human persons. And we say with respect to the essence of God, we can't predicate affirmations of the essence. We can't predicate denials. And think about some of the classical attributes. God is timeless. Well, that doesn't mean that there's this positive attribute called timelessness, which we identify with God. Rather, timelessness means that in his essence, God altogether transcends the categories of time. We said that God is incorporeal. Well, incorporeality is not a positive attribute. It is a denial. It is apophatic theology. God altogether transcends what it means to have a body. And of course, in the incarnation, the Logos does take on a true body. But that is not with respect to his divine nature. It is with respect to his human nature, though by that union he communicates divine energies of the human nature, thus enabling our deification. And so that's the basic Palamite understanding of God. But what this does is it enables us to understand the mode in which God has genuine freedom. Because if God's activity is totally identical to what makes God God, what that means is that everything which God does, he does necessarily. In other words, because what God does is identical to what God is, for God to be God, he must have done exactly what he has done. He must have created the world because his activity is identical to what makes him God, and he has acted in creating the world. Now, this is not just some silly Orthodox polemic. This is a genuine philosophical problem, which St. Thomas himself recognized. St. Thomas simply said, well, I appeal to mystery. Well, I think that's a bit of a cop-out, because mystery does not mean there is a genuine contradiction philosophically, which we can then wave off. Mystery refers to when we can describe God, but of course the descriptions don't circumscribe him. And in a sense, he will always transcend those descriptions, even though they are objectively true. So that's a serious philosophical problem with absolute divine simplicity as understood in the Thomistic tradition. Because God's being is not identical to God's activity, we understand that God could have freely acted in a whole variety of ways. He could have acted in not creating the world. He had the genuine freedom to create the world, which makes it wholly an act of grace. And the energies themselves are distinguished from one another. They interpenetrate one another in an infinite amount of ways. But that infinite amount of ways is still limited. And you might be asking the question, well, how can that be? That sounds like a contradiction. How can it both be infinite and limited? Well, the analogy I would use is just to go to numbers. I'm a mathematical realist, mathematical Platonist, and I think the numbers are a wonderful way. They are truly an expression of the energies of God, because the energies of God, the Logos is called the Logos in virtue of the Father always energizing in the Son, so all the energies are summed up in him. And mathematics captures many truths about the divine energies. So think about numbers. There are an infinite number of ways that you can permute numbers with one another. There are an infinite number of ways you can multiply numbers with one another. given that the amount of numbers are infinite, and you can multiply any number by any other number. But it's also limited in the sense that 2 times 2 is always going to equal 4. Even though the amount of possible permutations of those numbers is infinite, there are still some permutations which are non-existent. So that's what I mean when I say God's energies are infinite, and they are also limited. They interpenetrate in an infinite variety of ways. I'm sorry if this is getting kind of dense. I have articles on this as well. I would also say that mathematics and the real world is filled with fractals. There are genuine fractals in the concrete visible creation. And in the abstract world of mathematics, there are many, many fractals as well. And indeed, when you project those fractals out in an image, just from the abstract world, it looks very much like fractals in the real world, which indicates, I believe, that the real world is actually based on this plan in the mind of God, whom we call the Logos. Now, in case you don't know what a fractal is when you have a thing and you look deeper inside the thing, you find it's composed of littler versions of itself. If that's confusing, just Google it. But God's energies are also fractal. So one of God's energies is love, but there are an infinite number of particular forms of God's love, which are timeless. We should also understand the energies are Trinitarian. The Father eternally loves the Son, and the Son eternally loves the Father back, and the Spirit eternally carries the love of Father and Son to one another. They are always expressed towards another person. And we say that the energies are expressions of God's essence or being, but they do not wholly contain it. Now, importantly, we also say that there are contingent manifestations of the energies, which St. Gregory Palamas says this is the sense in which we can speak of created energies. The analogy he uses, or that David Bradshaw uses, which I've described before, is that of love. A husband loves his wife from day to day. It's the same energy from day to day. But there are different ways of expressing that energy to her. One day he may buy her flowers. The next day he may give her chocolate. Next day he may take her on a vacation. Gets very expensive, but these are different manifestations of the same energy. And so there is not an eternal energy of God called creation, because God actively chose to create the world, but creation is a contingent expression of God's timeless energies. And that's why we say, by the way, that God's love is more ultimate than his judgment. Because God's judgment, God's wrath, is not eternal. The 3 persons of the Trinity aren't wrathful towards one another. God's wrath is a contingent expression of his desire to cleanse the world and uphold the world and be faithful to his world. It is a contingent expression of that in response to particular realities in the world, in the creation. And that's a very important point to make. Now, my explanation of all of this is because it's very important to understanding the way that the classical theistic portrait of God is understood. The Orthodox tradition is wholly congruent with the biblical text. So I haven't planned this video out in advance, but I'll kind of take up these points as I think of them. The first one I want to do is just to talk a little bit about open theism. Open theists will turn to a variety of texts in the Bible where God seems to change his mind. And in fact, a classical theist would have to say God hasn't changed his mind. He's talking as if he has, but he hasn't. And by the way, I think the prophets who experienced God knew this very well. And what I would suggest he was actually going on is this is God using the Socratic method. Socrates asks questions of his disciples, and he knows the answer to those questions, but he wants his disciples to consider those answers themselves, because in the process of thinking through it, they will learn more about the truth. Now, if this seems to be a foreign imposition on the biblical text, give me a few minutes, because I came to this conclusion as I was working through the Bible itself. Let's consider Genesis 18, right? This is one of those instances where Abraham, as a prophet, makes intercession before God. As we've discussed before, to be a prophet means that you have the Spirit dwelling within you, So you're united to God through the Spirit, and it means that you are on God's heavenly council. It's through the Spirit you have God's ear, and you're a member of his council, and as such, you can make intercessions before God. That's what Genesis 20 says. God says to Abimelech, Abraham is a prophet, therefore he will pray for you. Intercession is intimately related to the prophetic calling. But Abraham asked God a whole series of questions. Will you not spare the city for 50? Will you not spare the city for 40? Will you not spare it for 10? Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? And God just answers him as he asks the questions. What is the lesson out of all of this? The lesson is that by the end of that conversation, Abraham has learned that God will never sweep away the righteous with the wicked. He'll get them out of the city, which is what happens in the narrative. Through that dialogue with God, he's learned something about God. Now you might be saying, well, Cabane, this isn't that passage where God seems to actually change his mind, so you're dealing with an irrelevant passage. Well, let's go to the intercession of Moses after the golden calf incident in Exodus 32 to 34. Remember what I said was that this dialogue that God has with his creatures, particularly his prophets, because he's in direct communion with them through the Spirit, that dialogue is to grow them in wisdom. It's to teach them something about himself. And in Exodus 32 to 34, this fits very beautifully into the context. Because if you think about what it is, what's the whole theme of the book of Exodus? The theme of the book of Exodus is the revelation of God's name. Now, the name of God in the Old Testament refers to his character. The name Yahweh carries the connotation of he who was and is to come, because the Hebrew text has that full lexical range, which is explicit in Revelation, because that's what God called. He who is and was and is to come, and he is he who causes Israel to be. Now God says to Moses that by his name Yahweh, he will now reveal himself, but he revealed himself to the patriarchs as El Shaddai, or God the Almighty. Now, of course, liberal scholars will use this to justify silly things like the documentary hypothesis, but in fact this has always been understood in both Jewish and Christian traditions to refer to a particular manifestation of God's character, which is unique to the Exodus and onward. In the patriarchal period, the principal name by which God was known was El Shaddai, or God the Almighty. This is because what the patriarchs knew God as is the promise maker. He was the one who made promises to them, and because he was God Almighty, he had the absolute power to keep them. Well, in the Exodus, God is manifested not just as the mighty promise maker, but as the promise keeper. He's the one who fulfills those promises which he made to the patriarchs. He is the one who is faithful to his word. And indeed, you find the word name used over and over again in Exodus. And in Exodus chapter 9, God says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed among all the earth. In other words, in the Exodus, the Gentiles will come to know what God's character is. And this is not just a revelation of judgment. God extends his hand to the Gentiles. There were many Gentiles who came out of Egypt with Israel. In Exodus 12, we're told about this mixed multitude. In Joshua 5, all of them are circumcised together, because nobody was circumcised in the wilderness, but the mixed multitude and the genetic sons of Israel were all circumcised together, and God adopted them into his family. Rahab converts because she had heard of what God had done in the Exodus. The revelation of God's character, of his name to the world through the Exodus, brought many to salvation, and it brought many to the kingdom. And in Exodus 32 to 34, this is absolutely central, because Israel has sinned against God, and Moses has to go up the mountain and intercede with God for forgiveness. Now, what form does this intercession take? Well, what God says is, I am sick of these people. I am going to wipe them all out, and I'm going to create a new nation out of you. And what does Moses say? Moses says, oh, don't do this, because what will the Gentiles say What will the Gentiles say about you? They're going to say, he promised to bring them to the promised land and he broke that promise. They aren't going to understand your true character. They're not going to understand your true name. They're not going to understand your attributes. And God says, you know what? You're right. So I won't do that. Now, what series of events is this part of? This is part of the revelation of God's character or name to Moses. Through having this debate with God, God has taught Moses something about himself. God has taught Moses that he will never break his covenantal promises. And what indeed does God say before the theophany to Moses? He says, he will reveal his name to Moses, and he will make all his goodness pass before him. Well, there you see, these are the energies of God which are being identified with God's attributes. His goodness will pass before him because it is God's goodness which leads him to be wholly faithful unconditionally to the people of Israel. And when God passes before Moses, he says, and this is one of the most important passages in all the Old Testament. So let me just pull it up. It said, the Lord passed before him, note the Passover language, and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands of generations, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Then Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. So through this series of events, God has manifested his name to Moses. This means to manifest his character. Moses has engaged God in this kind of debate. And through that debate, he has learned something about God. He's learned his name in a deeper way. He has learned that God is utterly faithful to his covenant, but he also does not clear the guilty. And that is manifested in the destruction of 3,000 by the Levites. But ultimately, the people are brought to the promised land, no matter how much of a roundabout way they have to get there. And so God manifests his name, Yahweh, in part through this dialogue he has. Now remember, I connected this to the prophetic calling. Prophet means to have the Spirit to be on the divine council. And this is my thesis here about the purpose of these debates that God has with his prophets is strengthened in the book of Job. Now the book of Job is not just a random series of speeches. It has a very particular purpose. It illustrates the maturation of humanity. Remember I said Adam was created a spiritual child, but ultimately God wanted to grow him up and glorify him with the Spirit. He wanted to put him on the divine council, but Adam tried to seize that seat too early. In Job, the book opens with a vision of the divine council. God sits in his heavenly court, and Satan comes before him, because remember, he was still in the divine council at this time. He was the God of that age. In Revelation 12, after the ascension, he's cast out, but Satan comes before God. And note that Satan does not point Job out to God. And then God says, oh, God points out Job to Satan. Satan wasn't paying attention until God pointed him out. And then Satan wanted to strike him. So God actually pointed out one of his righteous servants to Satan. Why would he do that? Part of the purpose of the book is answering this question. Why do we suffer? Why does God allow Satan to inflict on us such unjust suffering? The book answers this question because through Job's suffering, he is transfigured and made wise. If you read the book of Job, it has all sorts of similarities with Proverbs, with the Song of Solomon, with Ecclesiastes. This is part of the wisdom books of the Old Testament. I believe that Job was written by Solomon. And I've heard that actually St. Gregory the theologian affirmed the same thing, that Job is a Solomonic book. And Job provides an alternative ending to the Solomon story. Job is a king. Throughout the book, he's described with his kingdom. His three friends, that word friend specifically means counselor to the king. These are his three counselors, and what's going on is that there's a coup. The kingdom is in chaos because of what has happened to Job. And they need to get rid of Job. And that is why he speaks so harshly against them. They are not his buddies. They are his counselors who are now betraying him. And the purpose of the book is to show Job's transfiguration, because what happens at the end? He doubles his inheritance. He has twice as many animals as he did before, and he has the same number of children as he did at the beginning, because, of course, your children are not ever ultimately destroyed, so it doubles it. He's got 22,000 animals, 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. He's got a full alphabet of animals, by the way, that has connections to the Logos, because the Logos is the person through whom we become wise, through whom we come to know God truly, and because the whole world is created as an icon of the face of God, it's the means by which we come to know the world. The Logos is the rationality, the Word of God. Language is a result of the Logos, and here Job has a full 22 piece set of wisdom. He comes to know God more deeply through the Logos. He doubles his kingdom. What happened to Solomon? Solomon was unfaithful and his kingdom was cut in half. So, cool connection there. But at the end of the book, Job is elevated to the divine council. What does he do? He makes intercession for his three counselors, and God forgives them because of his intercession. Now, if you know the Bible, you know Genesis chapter 20, that means he's a prophet, because prophets, because they have the Spirit, have the unique capacity to go before God in the divine council and make intercession for others. So the fact that Job intercedes here demonstrates that he has been matured by the Spirit. He's been transfigured. He has gotten higher to where he was at the beginning of the book. We saw the divine council at the beginning of the book, and Job was not privy to its proceedings. Now he himself is elevated to the divine council. How was he so elevated? Well, it was through his suffering. That is the answer of the book. Why did God point Job out to Satan so that Satan could inflict these sufferings on him? Because God wanted to mature Job from childhood to spiritual adulthood, to transfiguration through the Spirit. And this is the point of the vision of Leviathan. Leviathan shows that it is God uniquely who has a rope in his nose and has pierced his jaw with a hook. Leviathan, the dragon, is an image of Satan. Dragons and serpents are deeply associated in the Bible. Isaiah 27 refers to Leviathan, the dragon, as the serpent. And the passage here has many similarities with other passages about Satan, such as in Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14 describes Satan as day star, son of the morning. By the way, just trust me on this, that is about Satan. I'll get to that at another video. I'll demonstrate that to you. But look up Michael Heiser if you want the answer now. So in Isaiah, Satan is the day star, the son of the morning. He's the son of the dawn. And here, Leviathan's eyes are as the dawn. The purpose of this vision is to show that because God has a rope in his nose and has pierced his jaw with a hook, no matter how rebellious Satan wants to be, God has ultimate control over him. And so God had a purpose in allowing and actually pointing Job out to Satan. God has a purpose in letting him inflict those judgments on Job. And that is the overall message of the book. Job has become matured in wisdom. Now, what relevance does that have to what I was talking about? What relevance does that have to the question of why God has these debates with men? Well, because in Job 38 to 41, which is all an answer to everything that Job has said, this is where God asks a series of questions to Job. He asks Job questions about the world. Look around at the world. Tell me this. Tell me that. Gird up your loins and tell me what this is. He lists to him a whole series of animals and asks Job to explain what these animals means. This is one reason I think it comes from the Solomonic wisdom literature, because this is what Solomon does. Read 1 Kings. Solomon, like Adam, Solomon gets to a higher point than Adam because God gives him wisdom. He doesn't seize it by force. But like Adam, you have a whole series of animals which are brought to Jerusalem, and Solomon gives speeches about them. Solomon learns wisdom from animals because animals are symbols of man and God. They're created through God's energies, all of which are summed up in his Son, and thus the images of his Son, us. This is just like Adam in Genesis 2. What did Adam do? The animals were brought to him and he gave them names. Remember what I said about names? Names are particular properties or attributes. And Adam learns wisdom because he sees the animal. He perceives the nature which gives it its identity, and he gives it a name proper to that nature, which she has perceived. And then what does God do? God creates Eve, and he brings her to Adam, just like he brought the animals to Adam. And after Solomon gets all of these animals, then a woman, a bride, symbolically, I'm not saying he married the Queen of Sheba, bride is brought to him, the Queen of Sheba, and this is the climactic statement of his wisdom. Just as Adam gave forth a poem when Eve was created, so also Solomon gives her very impressive wisdom. This is how we learn wisdom. We study the world. You read Proverbs, there are all sorts of lessons that Solomon brings out of animals. And here in Job 38 to 41, you have the same kind of thing. You have a series of animals in Job 38 to 39 asked about. You've got Behemoth in 40 and Leviathan in chapter 41. And so Job is learning wisdom through these animals. And so he has matured to double his kingdom in chapter 42. My point in saying all this is to point out that the reason that God is questioning Job in this way is because he's using the Socratic method. I mean, truly, obviously it wasn't derived from Socrates. Socrates was wise, so he got it. But God is using the Socratic method. His purpose throughout the book has been to make Job mature so that he could give him twice the inheritance he had at the beginning, so that he could elevate him to the divine council. And the way that he does so, in his final speech, is to ask Job a series of questions about the world that challenge Job to tell him something. And then Job does become wise when he meditates on those questions. Same thing with Amos. The visions of Amos include Amos's intercession before God on behalf of Jacob. God shows him 3 different things that he's planning to do to Israel. The first 2, he says, how can Jacob stand? They can't stand. They can't endure this. And then the third one, he says, okay, that's fine. Do that. Here, Amos is learning about the duality of God's judgment and his mercy. He does judge justly, but he does not lay on Israel as severe a judgment as he could have. Amos learns a lesson that way. So, I say all of that in order to answer the question of, does the God of the Old Testament conform to classical theism in terms of his comprehensive knowledge? Why does he appear to change his mind when he says, first I'll destroy Israel, and then no, I'm not going to destroy Israel? This is part of God's mode by which he reveals himself to those who have the Spirit, to the prophets. They learn wisdom when they engage in these kind of back and forth debates, so to speak, with God. So that's, of course, not the only question about classical theism. So the next one I want to talk about is divine embodiment. Mormon apologists have really made this a live question. They challenged Christians to defend the doctrine of divine incorporeality. They point to early Christian and Jewish statements which seem to indicate that God is a body, and so on and so forth. And there are even some who are not Mormons in the broader Christian tradition who would now say, yes, God is embodied because look at what the Old Testament says. The first thing I want to say about this is we have to ask the question, what do we mean by incorporeality? If you remember what I said about apophatic theology earlier, this is not an attribute of God, right? Incorporeality is not a positive statement about what God is. It's a denial. And the denial is that God absolutely transcends categories of embodiment, because the Fathers teach that even our denials, to some degree, do not capture the reality of God's comprehensive nature. And so in predicating these denials of God's nature, we say God absolutely transcends that category in his essence, but he does manifest something of himself in his infinitely diverse energies. Those are the means by which we know God. So what does it mean to be embodied? This is a question you have to start with, because frankly, I don't think that Mormon apologists, or those who critique them, I think Mormon apologists tend to get the best of those exchanges in the question of embodiment, but I don't think either side has really started from first principles and asked, well, what is embodiment in the first place? How do we define embodiment? Only after we've answered that question can we then move on to the question, does God have a body? Well, we should remember to begin with, within the Orthodox tradition, because that's the form of classical theism I'm defending, what started the Palamite controversy? It was the question of the true visibility of God. It was monks who would claim to see the divine light, the divine glory, and they said, that's God. That's not a created symbol of God. The divine light is uncreated. That is God as he manifests himself to us, and it is a true and real manifestation of God himself. Whereas Barlaam, who had received his theological education in the West and was influenced by certain implications of Western theology, I'm not saying that all the West is guilty of that, but I mean, there's a relationship there. Barlaam said, no, these are created symbols of God. They aren't really God. They're just something that God creates as a symbol. So the divine light is created. A series of councils in Constantinople issued the definitive verdict that St. Gregory Palamas was right. These are true visible manifestations of God. And the question of the divine light is obviously richly connected with the Old Testament, because we hear about God's glory all the time. His glory, this bright cloud, is that which dwells in the tabernacle and dwells in the temple. Moses shines with the glory of God, and because he's shining with the glory of God, after God has manifested his name to him, Israel is afraid and draws back, and he has to cover himself. Just like when God came down in Exodus chapter 19. When God came down on the mountain, Israel was afraid, drew back, and they said, Moses should go up for us. So that's one of my favorite passages from the Old Testament about deification, that kind of parallelism there. I think it's clear Moses has been deified through his vision of the divine glory, just as Orthodoxy holds in its own spiritual teaching. But the point I want to make here is Orthodoxy, which is a form of classical theism, actually affirms that God is truly visibly manifest as God. It's not a created symbol. We can see God in the sense that we see his energies. But I would also want to add that this is actually how we see other people too. Do we see another person directly? Do we see their nature directly? When we look at them, are we looking at their nature? No, we're looking at manifestations of their nature. The soul is the form of the body. I don't want to equate the nature with the soul exclusively, but it's just kind of an analogy. It forms the body. We see a person's nature only insofar as it expresses itself in visibility. And remember, we only see things because light is refracted off our skin. And our skin reacts in a particular way with it so as to produce visibility. And we know another person through what they do. Like they love. If they love people, we call them loving. If they are unjust, we call them unjust. It all has to do with their energies or their activities which express their nature. And so we say that God is visible as God in the exact same way that men are visible as men. It truly does express something of what he is, even before the incarnation. And so if you mean embodied in the sense that God is spatially manifest as God, then yes, we would say that God does have a body. So then we have to ask the question, why does God appear as a man in the Old Testament? Oftentimes, not always, sometimes God appears as this bright cloud, but oftentimes God appears looking like a man. Genesis chapter 18, the Lord appeared to Abraham, and he came and sat down with Abraham. He looked like a man. So did the two angels on either side of him. This is a vision of the pre-incarnate Christ, by the way, but he looked like a man even before the incarnation. Well, some have said, well, this is an appearance of the resurrected Christ, but because of God's relationship with time, that could happen. Personally, I don't like that at all, because I think it's clear and self-evident that there are tensed truths. So, for example, if God is equally present to all moments in his manifestation, in his energies, by the way, energies are the means by which we experience conscious states. And it's the same, in my opinion, for God. I'll talk about that when I talk about divine emotion. But I don't want to affirm that time is just a line which all exists at once. I want to say there really are particular truths dependent on the particular moment of time, and that our present moment is more real than the future moment. I mean, there's an objective now truth. And so I don't think the idea that these are appearances of the resurrected Christ are valid, and it really doesn't have any precedent within the Orthodox tradition, I believe. I've never read any liturgical text or any father of the church or any saint speak about that way. The only person I've heard is Alexander Calamiris, who has all sorts of problems theologically. But anyway, we don't want to affirm that, so we have to say that these are true visible appearances of the pre-incarnate Logos. And he appears truly as God, he is spatially manifest as God, and he is truly spatially manifest looking like a man. So how do we understand that? Well, I think the answer is actually relatively simple. The fathers of the church teach that the image of God is the whole person. The whole person is made in the image of the Logos. It's not just the soul. It's not just the rationality, though the image entails rationality because we're images of the Logos. The Logos is he in whom all things find their relationship to one another, which is what makes it intelligible. So we have rationality because of all the information, so to speak, which constitutes the universe, is in principle inside of us, which is why a cat cannot identify the universal nature of a thing, but man can. That's what distinguishes man from animals. We can see universals. We can understand universals. But our body also is the result of our creation in the divine image. And the reason for that is because God made a universe which was truly and visibly symbolic of himself. Every particular aspect of the universe expresses a truth about God, expresses some divine attribute or another. Water expresses something of God. Particular animals express something of God, which is why we can study them and learn about God that way. Visible things truly do express something about God, and man is created in the divine image, and so everything about our body expresses something about God. The Bible looks at a lot of this visual and bodily symbolism about God. The fact that we have 5 fingers, that means something about our image of divine rule over the world. The foot has a particular association in the Bible with the Spirit and with prophets. Why? Well, you look at prophets. Jesus says about those who have the Spirit, they blow wherever they wish. You can't grasp them exactly. That's not something that's just true about himself. He's the prototypical prophet who was born by the Spirit, but it's true of everyone who's born by the Spirit, which is what it means to be a prophet. And indeed, you go to Ezekiel, what happens? Chariot of God with the Spirit inside of it comes. Ezekiel is filled with the Spirit, he's lifted up, and then he's just flying here and there. Prophets in the Old Testament, they're travelers. Elijah and Elisha, they go here and there. They're always moving. They're always moving. And the foot, in that it gives us that capacity for movement, is particularly associated with the ever-moving Spirit, because we say God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but he's also new every morning, because he manifests himself in new ways every morning, and because his divine activities or energies are infinite. And so there are many other symbols of God that relate to the body in the scriptures, but those are just a couple specific examples. The point in saying that is that our bodily shape actually does relate to truths that inhere in God's mind. And so we say that God can be truly spatially manifest through his energies. And we also say that because we express ourselves to others, including in our visible aspect through energies, that our body itself is created in terms of a symbolic portrait of God. And so when God expresses himself, it is totally natural that he would look like a man, because we are created to express what God is in his energies perfectly. And so when God appears spatially and visibly, he expresses who he is to man, because man is the image of the Logos. And this is the problem that James Jordan has pointed out with appeals to quote-unquote anthropomorphic language. And gets it backwards. Nobody in the Bible speaks of God anthropomorphically. Nobody. Man is a theomorph, which is why it is appropriate to speak of God having hands and eyes and feet. And if you think that I'm denying divine incorporeality, listen to the video again, because I'm not. What I mean by divine incorporeality is that God altogether transcends categories of embodiment because he is sovereign and he is not limited spatially. Dimitri Staniloae teaches that space is created as a theater for divine communion. As the universe grows up and matures into the glory of God, the obstacle, so to speak, created by space, that is distance of one thing from another, is overcome not by the abolition of space, but by God's full presence in all of space, which unites all things together perfectly, so that the distance between one another is no longer a limitation in terms of their communion. And so God fills the whole creation with his glory. And when God spatially manifests in the Old Testament, that particular space expresses what it is supposed to be to the fullest extent. It expresses fully the glory and the communion of God. And because the human body expresses that, God appears in human form. The Logos appears in human form. Just consider, we have limbs that point in all directions, and our head points up. So we have our arms pointing to one side, our feet pointing down, and our head pointing up. It expresses, and you might think this is a stretch, but actually this is an important feature of biblical theology. Four things generally express the fullness of creation. Four corners of the earth, there are the four edges of the cross, there are the four rivers of Genesis 2 which go to the ends of the earth, many other examples I could bring up. But what it expresses is God's intent to fully fill the universe in every direction, in every spatial location with himself. And that's why he appears in the Logos in human form. So what does this mean in terms of the canon? Well, Deuteronomy 4 says that Israel should not make images of God because they saw no form. He does not say that he has no form. He says that they saw no form. Because in the Old Testament, except for the prophets who were given the Spirit in a special way and thus had direct communion and experience with God, in the Old Testament, God was always concealed in a deep darkness. When the high priest went before God in the Holy of Holies, he had to create a cloud of incense in front of himself, which in one sense symbolizes the glory of God, but in another sense, it protects him because it blocks him from seeing anything in the Holy of Holies, which is where the glory of God dwells. God is visible, but if you don't have the Spirit, it's going to kill you. And that can be followed by resurrection, by the way. What happens in the story of Jacob? Well, God wrestles with him. That wrestling is an expression of what God has been doing for his entire life. Jacob was not an evil man. His deceit was just. We've spoken of this before. But what God was doing is he was allowing him to suffer. And through that suffering, Jacob labored in prayer and tears, which is what the prophets say. And eventually, he was matured. And that's what God does to him. God wrestles with him as an expression of what he's been doing. How he's been allowing Satan to persecute him. Remember the story of Job. And then what happens at the end of this wrestling, which expresses what the whole purpose of this was? Jacob sees God. The sun rises, and he sees God as the sun rises on him. And he does die in a sense. God has beaten him up through persecution. But that death is unto glorification and resurrection. Remember, in a sense, Adam died in order that he might live, in order that he might be glorified with his wife. He was put into a deep sleep, a death sleep, so that he might be glorified. Jesus died on the cross, and he emerged from the tomb in a glorified body. It is only through suffering and through death that we are glorified. So when God appears, it will kill you. The question is whether you're going to rise from the dead on the other side. Same thing in Exodus 34. Moses is put into the cave, under the ground, in a grave in a sense, and he comes out and he's glorified. He's shining with the glory of God. And so in the Old Testament, the Israelites saw no form. God concealed himself because they were not prepared to see. But what are we told in the Gospel of John? No one has ever seen God, but God the only Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has expressed him. He has made him known. He has exegeted him. And this is a big theme throughout John's Gospel, that now, under the new covenant, through the incarnation, we have seen his glory. It's no longer concealed. And this is why John's Gospel speaks about the form of God and the form of Christ over and over again. Thomas says, show us the Father. And Jesus says, the Father is in me and I'm in the Father. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. He wholly expresses the divine glory which belongs to God. What Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, he says, now through the Spirit, whereas old Israel simply heard the law, they learned through hearing. Now in the new covenant, God has transfigured that and glorified it so that we see the glory of God in the face of Jesus the Messiah. And this is, by the way, this is the biblical heart of St. John Damascus' argument for iconography, that God has revealed himself and glorified the old covenant, which is about hearing, and it's the new covenant, which is about seeing, and hearing lifts us up to the sight of God. And so that is one of the major points of the biblical narrative, that the form which was concealed in the Old Testament is now revealed in the new covenant. So, let me say a few words at this point, because it seems the best place to say it, about the forms, the philosophical concept of forms. Plato and Aristotle both held it in different ways. Socrates may have held it. We don't have any of his original writings, so we really don't know. And then the Neoplatonists, I believe the writings of St. Dionysius, the Areopagite, were actually authentic. That is complete academic heresy, and if you disagree, it's fine. But I just want to say this so that a person doesn't misunderstand what I actually believe. Jerome mentions the writings of a certain Greek Christian who composed works on the mystical hierarchy. The only person who fits that description is Dionysius, but according to the conventional view, Dionysius' writings weren't supposed to appear for another 2 centuries, and it wasn't written by the disciple of Paul. Anyway, I say that in order to say I think the Neoplatonists were actually drawing from Christian theology, and the reason I say that is because, as Elizabeth de Gizer has shown, the development of Neoplatonism by Porphyry and Plotinus was part of a project in which the Roman Empire responded to Christianity. They had to create a new philosophical basis within which the traditional religion nested. And so one of the criticisms that the Neoplatonists made of Christianity, ironically, is that it wasn't monotheistic enough. They did believe in a supreme, transcendent, necessarily existing creator God, but they said these other gods are manifestations of him. So it's an interesting tidbit, but philosophically and metaphysically, you could describe me as a Neoplatonist. Neoplatonism holds that the supreme God is beyond being. Why is he beyond being? Because being entails intelligibility. Intelligibility comes through making distinctions. We compare and contrast one thing with another. We say this is and it is not. And through that network of comparisons, we make intelligible particular things and we give them particular names. A tree is not a rock. Why? They have different properties. A tree is this, 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 and this, and it's not this, 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 and this. These properties are the forms. They are what give things their particular nature. And so I'm definitely a realist when it comes to forms. I think there are certain universal natures. I think there is human nature. And human nature exists only through the existence of human persons. Nature is the content of person, and what makes the person not who he is, but what he is. So I think there are real natures. There are real natures for each particular created kind that God made in the beginning. Each of those has a distinct and irreducible nature. And we say that those natures are logi, or logoi, in Erasmian pronunciation. They're logoi. Each nature is a logos. In other words, it's a particular thought in the mind of God. Remember I said the energies permute with one another in infinitely various ways. And so the nature of a particular thing is one such permutation, which God contingently expresses in creation as he gives it concrete existence in his contingent world. So each created thing, each nature, its form is the particular its particular mode of participation in a particular set of God's energies. Now, I'm going into all of this because understanding this way of viewing the forms and way of viewing the logos will explain how I see it in biblical theology. So, a form is a particular set of energies that are permuting in a particular way, and that is then contingently expressed by God in creating particular things which have the same nature. And this is Neoplatonic because we understand the forms to be processions, it's another word for energies, from the mind of a personal God, who actively knows the world through his energies, in which all things exist. We call the Son the Logos of God because the Father is always energizing in the Son. There is a particular mode of relationship which the divine persons have with one another through their expression of their energies. Now, of course, all persons, because they share the same nature, radiate the same energies, but they point those energies toward one another, in a sense, in a unique way. So the Father always acts through the Son and in the Spirit, for example. You'll find that everywhere in the Bible. The Son is the speech of God. The Spirit is the breath of God. Whenever you speak, you're always breathing out. You're always breathing out these things. Song is glorified speech. The Son is the speaker. The Spirit is the singer. The Spirit sings out the words of the Son with particular notes by elevating and decreasing his tone of breath. There's a lot of good biblical theology there. But we call the Son the Logos because the Father is always energizing in the Son. And because the forms are energies, that means all of the forms are summed up in the Son. Now, I point this out because if you understand this, and if you understand that all Old Testament theophanies are theophanies of the Logos, in whom all the energies are summed up, through the Spirit who makes him present, then the word form actually has an interesting connection here with the Neoplatonic or Dionysian understanding of God. Now you might be dubious and say, well, this is just a coincidence. So what I'm arguing so far is that the Logos is the form of the Lord. The three divine persons don't have like a separate visible appearance. The visible manifestation spatially of God, truly as God, is the Logos because all of the forms are summed up in him. He is the form of God. That's what Moses says about prophets. They behold the form of the Lord. That's what he says about super prophets, in a sense. These are two categories of prophets, one of which beholds the form of the Lord. So how does this relate to the Neoplatonic understanding of the relationship of concrete things to the forms? Well, how does Moses build the tabernacle? Moses builds the tabernacle by ascending up the mountain. He ascends into heaven. The top of the mountain corresponds to God's heaven, God's throne room. The middle of the mountain corresponds to the visible heaven, which is why when the elders ascend to the middle of the mountain, they see the sea of blue above them. In other words, they have not ascended above that, but God looks down upon them, and the land around the mountain corresponds to the earth. It's funny, actually. Some scholars, this just shows you how useless a PhD in Old Testament often is if you're a liberal scholar. Some scholars go, oh, there has to be multiple sources here in Exodus 19 because Moses ascends the mountain twice. It's like, if you honestly think that's a problem, you have not learned the first thing about biblical theology and the theology of the Holy Mountain and the way it's talked about in Scripture. It corresponds to the tabernacle, for heaven's sake. Haha, for heaven's sake, get it? Anyway, Moses ascends to the throne room of God, and he beholds the form of the Lord. And then he comes down, and he gives them commandments for the tabernacle. So, Moses beholds the form of the Lord, and through that, he is able to show them the pattern of the tabernacle. God speaks of Moses constructing the tabernacle according to the pattern which he had shown him on the mountain. It's interesting that the tabernacle, the instructions are dictated in speech. There's that logos idea, and we're told that the instructions are what they are because Moses beheld the form of the Lord. So he beheld the speech of God, the logos. Interesting connections there. Now, the tabernacle is a microcosm of the world. It's a symbolic creation. There are many different ways to show this, but one easy way to show it is just the instructions for the building of the tabernacle are given in 7 speeches. And if you work through the 7 speeches carefully, what you find is they correspond to the 7 days of creation. The first speech corresponds to what's made in the first day, the second speech corresponds to what's made in the second day, and so on and so forth. Easy way to see that, the 7th speech is all about the Sabbath, the 6th speech is about Bezalel and Aholiab. Bezalel is the constructor of the tabernacle. He's given the Spirit to do so, just as Adam was given the Spirit in Genesis 2. Aholiab is his helper, corresponding to Eve, who helps Adam cultivate the garden. If you try to use that as a justification for same-sex marriage, I'm going to punch you in the face. But anyway, the tabernacle is a microcosmic world. It's a symbol of the whole creation. And how did Moses know what pattern to use to build the tabernacle? Because he had seen the form of the Lord, and hence he had seen that pattern when he was up there in God's throne room, when he saw God. And so what this means, and follow me here because this is so important, what this means is that the creation was created on the pattern which exists in God's throne room, which exists in the form of the Lord. That is the pattern after which the creation was made. Understanding this means everything in Christian theology. It's so important because it tells you why the incarnation of the Logos redeems the whole creation, why it unites all things in him. It tells you why everything in the world is symbolic of God, because these things are created after the pattern which exists in God himself. So, I say that because this is the root of Neoplatonic theology and Neoplatonic philosophy. The forms are things which inhere in God. And everything in the creation is created in virtue of its participation of these forms which inhere in God, of these energies or logi, which are inhering in God's energies. And that you can find that through the interrelationship of the tabernacle with the world and how Moses was able to construct the tabernacle because he saw the form of the Lord. I'm saying the same thing over and over again because it's really complex, and so I want to say it in as many different ways as possible so that nobody misses the point here. So that's why I think Neoplatonism actually it's not imposed onto the Bible. If you read the Bible on its own terms, it emerges from the Bible. So classical theism, as understood in the Orthodox tradition, does have a deep congruence with what the Bible teaches. So far we've talked about instances where God appears to change his mind. We've talked about instances where God appears visibly before the incarnation. How does that relate to the doctrine of incorporeality? The final thing I want to talk about, and I want to say this won't take as long before, but who knows, because it's stream of consciousness. Final thing I want to talk about is divine emotion. Because this is what definitively separates classical theists from theistic personalists. Theistic personalists will point to the scripture describes God as having emotion. He loves and he hates. He's angry and he rejoices, and so on and so forth. And they'll say God has to have those emotions truly. They aren't just condescensions to us. And also, God is a suffering God. In the being of God, God is a suffering God because Christ reveals who God is and Christ suffers. The first thing I want to say about this is, insofar as suffering goes, St. Cyril of Alexandria put it this way: in Christ, God suffers impassibly. In other words, the impassible is passible. How? Because there's one divine person. The person of Christ is identical with the Logos. The person of Christ was not the result of the union of two natures, but the ground of it. It's the person of the Logos acting throughout the entire life of Christ. And he acts in particular ways through the human nature, which opens up particular capacities for action. God in himself does not sleep, but God does sleep in the incarnation, because sleep is an activity intrinsic that is done by a person, and it's the person of the Logos who sleeps. And God cannot die in himself. God dies in the person of the incarnate Christ. The Logos is truly killed, but he's killed because he takes on a human nature and voluntarily gives himself over to the corruption of the flesh. And because of that is able to die. And by the way, death never in the Bible means the cessation of existence. So the idea that this means that God ceased to exist is just ludicrous. Only materialists believe death is the cessation of existence. We say Christ took on a human body and a human soul. So when Christ died, He remained incarnate because the Logos still had a human soul, even though he had departed from his body. And so there is a sense in which the incarnation functions as it does precisely to allow God to participate fully in what it means to be a man who is in the flesh, who is corruptible, who is able to die. And so the argument that Christ reveals what God is, and therefore God must be a suffering God in himself, actually reverses what the incarnation is supposed to do. The incarnation functions precisely because God in himself cannot die or cannot suffer. Now, there is a real sense in which the entire life of Christ reveals who God is. It reveals the properties of God. And I don't want to eliminate that. So, divine emotion. Remember what I said earlier, how there are no true anthropomorphisms in the Bible? Man is a theomorph. So when God is spoken of in quote-unquote anthropomorphic terms, these are anthropomorphic because we're the images of God, right? And we have emotions. What are exactly our emotions? Emotions are our conscious perception of our energies. Sound odd? Well, think about love. Love is an activity. We choose to love somebody, but it produces a particular conscious state. Philosophers of mind would call these qualia. They're particular, irreducible, qualitative states of consciousness that we experience through our energies. And in union with another person, we share in one another's energies. As two persons are married to one another, bound by the Spirit, they become more and more like one another as time goes on. People often describe married couples actually coming to look like one another. This is part of what it means to participate in the mutual indwelling of the divine persons, because mutual indwelling is a function of energies. The Father glorifies the Son through the Spirit, and the Son glorifies the Father through the Spirit. That is what it means for the persons to mutually indwell, and men and women participate in each other's energies, and thus are made more like one another. And so when we're in union with another person, we have empathy. We experience the same qualitative states of consciousness that they do, to a large degree. And so, when we speak of divine emotion, we have to understand it in this sense. The Fathers, by the doctrine of impassibility, never meant that God did not truly have emotion. They never meant it. A lot of theistic personalists will say, well, the Fathers took this from Hellenistic philosophy, but as Paul Gavrilyuk and many other historians demonstrated, the doctrine of impassibility was not an essential part of Hellenistic philosophy. It was very much an open question. It was a focus of no Hellenistic philosopher. So that just doesn't work. The doctrine of impassibility is not understood to deny that God has true emotions. Now, because God's thoughts are not our thoughts, we can never grasp comprehensively what it feels like to be God, so to speak. But we say God truly does have emotions. He truly does love. God is not an unfeeling robot. God is not so transcendent that we cannot identify with him in some sense. This is a big problem, in my view, with Thomism. All of our love is only analogically related to God's love. It's just a symbol or an analogy. Whereas for Scotus, I believe, and I don't know Scotus metaphysics that well, but for Scotus and for St. Gregory Palamas in the Orthodox tradition, we speak of love univocally. In other words, love means the same thing for us as it does to God, but in God it's to a greater degree. This is a big advantage of Orthodox theology, in my view, because it gives a more organic justification of the biblical text. What impassibility means is that God is not limited. Impassibility is simply the result of the biblical doctrine of divine sovereignty. Throughout the Old Testament, the God of Israel is wholly sovereign over the world. As Benjamin Sommer has pointed out, you simply don't see the kinds of scenes that you see in a lot of pagan literature in the Near East in the Hebrew Bible. He does this in responding to those who suggest that the Bible contains elements of an earlier quote-unquote Yahwism, where Yahweh was just a minor patron God of Israel, not the high God. Sommer points out that we never see God being controlled by anything else. God is never shown being afraid that someone is going to thwart his plans. He is totally at peace because he is totally sovereign. That's what Isaiah is all about. God is sovereign over the nations. The king of Assyria comes conquering. Why? Because God is working through that. God is sovereign over the nations. He invites the pagan gods to court to contend with them. And he shows himself to be completely sovereign. He will do what he purposes through the word. That's what it says in Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 55. It is through the word that God does exactly what he has purposed for the world. His purpose is not thwarted. Nobody else can place a limitation on God. And so when we speak of suffering and death as being properties unique to the incarnate Christ, what we mean is that Christ took on human limitations. That is what cannot be had by God in himself, his limitations. So he takes on a human nature to redeem those limitations and to heal human nature. That's a really important point. So we do not deny that God's emotions are objective realities, but because of a proper biblical doctrine of God's sovereignty, we say God is totally sovereign over his emotions. And the fathers actually said that man is supposed to become impassible. Now, if impassibility really meant you have no emotions, then they would never say that man is to become impassible. They speak of divine apathy, meaning not, as in modern English, aloofness and uncaring, but apatheia in the sense that you are not controlled by your emotions. There are all sorts of examples I could give of human nature being controlled and enslaved to emotion. A wife or a husband who is so enslaved by the passion of lust that they break the marriage covenant. You are controlled by your emotions. You're not sovereign over them. A person who is prone to fits of rage and is so enslaved by his anger that he cannot control himself or she cannot control herself. And you just start throwing things around and unleashing mindless destruction. You are controlled by your emotions. By contrast, a mature and wise human person will have these qualitative experiences of consciousness, which we call emotions, but will not be enslaved to them. He or she will make the choices that they do based on deliberation on the objectively best course of action. Gavrila makes the analogy between a doctor, two kinds of doctors. One doctor feels so much empathy for his patient that he can't do the operation because he's weeping so hard that they would have to go through this and that their families would have to go through this. He can't control his grief. He feels so much empathy that he can't actually do the surgery. And so the person dies. You get a lot of empathy, but the person is still dead. On the other hand, there is a doctor who feels that emotion, feels that grief, but is able to control it, and so act in a purposeful and rational way, so as to actually bring healing to the patient, and thus to bring joy and healing to the patient's family. And so when we say that God is impassible, it means that there are no limitations that are put on God. God is never controlled by his emotions. He never judges the world just because he gets himself into a huge fit of rage and he just unleashes meaningless destruction. No, God's judgment is always very carefully and particularly chosen. The exact intensity of that judgment is chosen by God for objective and rational reasons. That's what Amos teaches us. When Amos has these visions and he begs God and he intercedes before God to not judge Israel too harshly. That's what he learns about God. God always chooses the exact nature and intensity of the judgment for a particular purpose. He is always deliberative in the sense that every action he takes with respect to the world has a particular end or goal in mind. He loves those who rebel against him. He desires that none should perish, but he does destroy them. If that person will bring destruction to the world, he will destroy them even though he loves him. He's not enslaved to his love so that he does not destroy a person when that person is destroying the world. And he is not enslaved to rage in that he always extends the hand of mercy. to those who are sinners. He loves them, and he therefore carefully takes a particular course of action which always has a particular purpose. And the other part of God's sovereignty is that when God acts to bring about a certain purpose, it unfailingly occurs. And so God is not limited by anything outside himself. You could potentially speak of God's quote-unquote inability to create a square circle as a limitation, but that's not a limitation. A square circle is a meaningless concept. You're just combining two words. And so God is quote-unquote limited by logic, but actually logic is just an expression of his nature. Logic is inherent in the person of the Logos. So that's what's meant by divine impassibility. And as far as I see it, these are all deeply biblical. I'm not just referring to impassibility now, I'm referring to everything. These are all deeply biblical instincts. Impassibility arises out of an absolute commitment to the biblical doctrine of God's absolute sovereignty. Likewise, God's incorporeality is the result of an absolute commitment to the biblical teaching that God is unlimited. And if we say that God spatially manifests truly as God, it's not just a created symbol, but we also say it is not as if God is only 6 feet tall and he can't spatially manifest in more space. He's not limited. He's sovereign, and so he altogether transcends the limitations of space. And in that sense, we call him incorporeal. And our understanding of God's comprehensive knowledge of the future also arises. Now, I understand this isn't a problem with most theistic personalists, but for the open theists, our commitment to God's comprehensive knowledge of the future also arises from the concern to preserve divine sovereignty. Because for the open theist, God only knows a range of probabilities. And if that's true, then his activities produce unintended consequences, and he can get himself all bound up in a series of problems that ultimately go back to him because the improbable actually happened. And so I remember hearing one open theist say about the prophecy that Cyrus would come, that God saw a dude named Cyrus and he decided to raise him to power because he saw an opportunity to fulfill a prophecy. I mean, that's just ludicrous. What that entails is God elevated Cyrus to power because of his name. On the contrary, God prophesied the coming of Cyrus because he had a particular purpose for Cyrus in virtue of the kind of person that Cyrus was. This is what it means to be wholly sovereign over the future, that all of your acts accomplish unfailingly what their purpose is. And so all of classical theism, as understood in the Orthodox sense, is derived principally from our biblical concern for God's absolute transcendence and sovereignty. I say the incarnation expresses simultaneously the transcendence and the immanence of God. The transcendence of God because it shows that there is a gap between us that needs to be bridged. It is bridged through the union of natures in the one person, the Logos. Also the immanence of God because God condescends to us in the fullest way possible through the incarnation. That's the gift of God. And the gift of God is what is meant by grace. God is wholly transcendent, he's wholly immanent, and that's revealed in the incarnation of the person of Christ. And so, to sum up, I know this video has been long. I hope you found it helpful. These are things I spent years thinking about and wrestling with. It's amazingly satisfying when you spent years wrestling with something that you finally come to an answer which you find satisfactory. Because I have no interest in passing off stuff to other people that I myself don't find perfectly persuasive. So it's immensely satisfying to be able to give this video or podcast, whatever you want to call it. So first point, not all classical theism is created equal. The Orthodox riff on classical theism is not the same as Thomism, and I think that Thomistic metaphysics, is in certain ways incompatible with the biblical revelation of God. Second, we say that God is incorporeal, in the sense that he wholly transcends the limitations of space, but that we can speak of God's body in the sense that when he spatially manifests himself, every aspect of that spatial manifestation is done truly as God. Abraham really saw God, and God appeared in the form of a man because he appeared as the Logos, and the form of a man is an expression of the Logos in relation to creation. And third and finally, impassibility does not mean the rejection of objective emotion in God. Rather, what it means is God's absolute sovereignty over his emotions. He's not enslaved to his emotions, but he can control them perfectly and carry out his will perfectly, not irrationally. Anyway, sorry for the length of the video. Hope you've enjoyed it. I will see you tomorrow.